Good evening, everyone. I'm Alex McKiernan. I'm the president of the Lydia Foundation for Social Engagement, and I want to thank you all for coming out today. This is the first Good Talks for the Good Life that we've ever held, and it's the first public event for the Lydia Foundation, and I'm really excited to have all of you here. I wanted to reflect briefly on why I'm here doing this and why I think this is important. I've been a volunteer firefighter for about the last 9 years, and in 2014, 5.5 years ago, I earned these in a pretty serious car crash outside of Lincoln. I was rear-ended, it damaged my spinal cord. I started out initially paralyzed, and my pager started going off because it was in our fire district, and it was my buddies, my brothers from Southwest Fire and Rescue, who came and cut me out of the car and put me on the helicopter. And as I was getting loaded on, one of my neighbors, my nearest neighbor, popped his head over my face and said, "What do you want me to do about Chloe, my wife?" And I said, "Go get her and our girls and tell her to call her cousin and her mom and have everybody meet at the hospital." And so he went and did that. He drove home and picked up my wife and our 3-year-old and our 9-month-old twins and drove through the intersection where I had just been hit and drove them to the hospital and stayed with them for hours along with other firefighters until they heard what had happened to me and what was going on with me. Now, this is a firefighter friend of mine who I don't think I agree with on anything politically. We do not see eye to eye on anything, but it doesn't matter. We have a shared commitment to our community and to each other, and when I needed him, he was there for me, and I hope that I've been there for him when he needs help as well. That's what's important, I think, about this country, is we can disagree and still try to build community together, and that's what the Lydia Foundation, I hope, can do. As much as we disagree in our communities and our state and in our nation, we need each other, and I hope that we can work together. The Lydia Foundation hopes that perhaps tonight you can hear or see something you haven't heard before. It's named for my mother, Lydia McKiernan, who was one of the most empathic people I've ever met. She would disagree with you, but she always had care and love for the people around her, and I hope that's what we can emulate in our work. Our goal is to create productive dialogue around divisive issues, and we think that requires not only an understanding of the facts, but also plenty of empathy for other perspectives. The Lydia Foundation does not pick winners. We don't support either side of this particular argument or any other argument. What we support is the conversation itself. We want to see people have productive conversation. We're not worried about conflict, but we want that conflict to be productive and take us somewhere together. Our goal tonight is really to simply celebrate and support our democracy. Sponsors for this evening, Lydia Foundation for Social Engagement. We're also supported by the Nebraska Cultural Endowment and Humanities Nebraska. And it's important to note that the views expressed here tonight on stage do not necessarily represent any of these organizations or our boards. So keep that in mind. As you all know, there are two potential options for medical marijuana to move forward in this state. One is LB 110 that's currently on general file in the unicameral, and the other is a ballot initiative for a constitutional amendment. And we're going to discuss that tonight with these two gentlemen. Luke Neferatos is Chief of Staff at Smart Approaches to Marijuana. That organization opposes legalization, and they are active in this state right now. Matt Schweik is the Deputy Director of the Marijuana Policy Project, and they support legalization and are active in the state right now. So, fellas, let's take a seat, and we'll get this conversation going if I don't screw up the tech. Center stage podium, look at that. Look at that. Chris, are they going to hear when we drink water? Is that?
Let's find out.
I'll drink quietly. Can't slurp. Can't slurp. Well, this is Grandma Ethel's table, is that right? Grandma Ethel's table. So it's going to help us have a nice conversation. All right, so I've talked about with these gentlemen some of the ground rules for this evening, and we'll share those with you as well. There we go. Ground rules, conversational behavior, so basically don't be a jerk. And these guys have great practice at that. We just had a meal together, and I think they spent more time talking to each other than anyone else. You two have been duking it out across the country, but you've never actually met.
We never met. This guy's been kicking my butt in most of the states across the country, and I couldn't wait to meet him.
Feeling was mutual.
So our goal tonight really, and I try to make my goal whenever I'm having a difficult conversation with somebody, my goal is to have that conversation again, not to win, not to persuade them, but make sure that I don't cross any lines that prevent me from talking to them again. So those are the ground rules for this evening. Moving on, I think we've got Mentimeter, which hopefully you all participate with. I think it'll be an interesting way to see what people think. Mentimeter is anonymous. You can participate in questions that we'll throw out, a few questions throughout the event. You can submit questions as well. We're not going to pass a mic around, but at the end, we do have a panel from our board that will be sort of moderating those questions that come in, and we'll get to pose those. It's not for the live stream, so if you're watching on the live stream, hopefully that top bar is edited out and you're not playing along, because I want to hear what these people in the room think. So, in order to practice, in a minute here, we'll throw up a practice slide for you. This is a very divisive topic, in my household anyway. And so I would like to settle this once and for all. If you all can weigh in, I think we've got some answers coming in, and we're going to be done with this discussion. Okay. No more talking.
This is important. This means a lot for this issue.
So this will give you a sense of how the thing works, and if we could see those results as they're rolling in, Kat, that would be awesome. I don't know if I need. There we go. Look at that. Thank you very much.
It's the only reason you set this thing up.
I wanted to settle some debates. Yeah. This is definitely common ground we can all stand on, I think. We're still getting a few in. So we've had 50 people participate. We'll do that a few times throughout the event. And again, it's anonymous. I think it's useful for us to know who are we talking to and what do they think. And clearly these people think that that as in our family, that our Irish heritage is very important, and I celebrate it every day right here. And I will continue to do so, because there are two. Okay, so moving on, unless you really got to get your vote in, we're going to move on. And this is what we're going to start with. I want everybody, if you're willing to participate, rate this following statement. With a doctor's help, Nebraskans should be able to legally obtain medical marijuana. If you rate it at a 4 or a 5, all the way over to the right, that's 100% agree with that statement. And over to the left, you totally disagree. And I'm just curious what this room looks like. I know that you guys have done polling, right, Matt?
Yep.
Not very recently.
No, it was a little while back. I believe it was early 2017 that we did the poll.
And there was pretty substantial support in that poll. I don't know how scientific it was or who did it, but
it was a pollster we trust. We've worked with in many states, and it showed support at 77%.
yeah.
So we also did a poll this year. It found support more about 51%, kind of within the margin of error. So also with a really good pollster. So you never know. Polls are polls.
Right. Well, and this clearly shows that this room definitely leaning towards the support of medical marijuana end, and I think that's important to know that this may be representative of the state, but perhaps a little bit to the support side as opposed to anti.
A little skewed.
Little skewed, and that's fine. I just think it's interesting to see what everyone thinks. So moving on, this is a fun exercise that I like to do. I really don't appreciate discussions when people just straw man argument, right? Where you attack a caricature of his argument and he does the same to you. So we're going to try to short circuit that a little bit, and we're going to do something called steel manning. And that's going to be where I'd like each of you to state the other guy's perspective on medical marijuana in terms that he would agree with. And I don't expect you to know it exactly, but I want you to do your best, and I'm going to start with you, Matt, to state Luke and Sam's perspective in ways that he would agree with. And obviously he's going to get a chance to do the same for you and critique you on how well you do. So
you can't edit this and put it in an
I feel a little bit like premarital counseling with my wife. I feel a little bit like we're doing one of those exercises.
Well, and you are allowed to get married in this state if you want to. That would be fine.
Well, okay, sounds good. My wife wouldn't like it very much though.
Well, you have to take care of that first.
I'll figure that out.
I believe Luke would say that we need more research on medical marijuana before it's made available to Nebraskans. And I believe he'd also say that passing this ballot initiative is a slippery slope to full legalization. And while medical marijuana may be a good policy, full legalization is a negative policy.
Is that fair?
So it's close, yeah. That's really, I think it's pretty good. I think if I were in your position, I think what you'd probably say is, there are patients out there who really need help, really need medications that'll work. We have an opioid crisis and people are dying, and we need something that has efficacy, and if this has some benefit, people should get access to that. And so I think that's probably what the focal point would be of what you say.
Is that
Yeah.
roughly accurate?
Yeah.
What was missing from his steel man?
I think, in my mind, I don't really necessarily look at medical marijuana as a Trojan horse as much as I look at it as a question of sound scientific public health policy. Do we think that we should put our medications to a vote versus through, a scientific process? So I think that's where I would defer, but I think you're right about research and all that too.
I think you perhaps missed out on the fact that people in Nebraska are already using medical marijuana. This is not something that we're going to create by passing a ballot initiative. It exists already, and the choice before voters in this state is how to contend with that reality.
That's fair. You mentioned science, and I want to move there. For me, I think good talks are often about separating the facts from how we feel about the facts. And this next slide will sort of delve into that a little bit. So again, I really try to understand the facts as best as they're known, and then talk about how I feel about the facts, because that's also very important. Where I've relied on for facts is the National Academy of Sciences. They did a massive analysis of research in 2017. The title of that 400-plus page document is Health Effects of Cannabis and Cannabinoids. And they rated evidence for all sorts of claims because, marijuana, CBD, they have a bit of a snake oil perspective at times where they're going to solve every problem. And this work tried to rank things in terms of the evidence being conclusive, substantial, moderate, limited, or insufficient to make some of those claims. You can find that online. We've got some of them up here if people want to look at later. Very well produced and accessible science. As far as I could find, that is the best available science. I'm losing my mic here. I'm like too dynamic with my motions.
Yeah, I noticed mine too. We'll see. As long as they can hear us, it's good. Otherwise, we'll just have a conversation up here.
I'll just hold it like this. Yeah. Okay. And so I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to push a little bit on you here. So let's look at some of the science that's really in favor. You mentioned it in noting what you thought, how you thought Matt would steel man. This is some select positive findings. There are dozens and dozens of findings in this work, and I encourage people to go look at it. But in that work, they found through lots of other research that there's conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids are effective treatment for chronic pain in adults, and you'd mentioned that. Antiemetics for chemo-induced nausea, so preventing people from being nauseous, and for improving reported spasticity from MS patients. So that to me feels like a factual basis based on what I'm reading here. Do you agree that marijuana is useful in those ways, and perhaps others, but in those ways? And if so, why is that not a convincing argument?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because I think this is fantastic research. So I want to draw everyone's attention to or cannabinoids in this statement at the top. So one thing, a major point of agreement that you'll hear from both Matt and myself, and I think you as well, is that there's absolutely medicinal benefit to the marijuana plant. I don't think anybody can debate that because the FDA has already approved several medications that are marijuana-based. That CBD, which is called Epidiolex, which you can get a prescription for. You have, blanking on the name, but pure THC, Marinol, pure THC, which you can get a prescription for as well. So the FDA has already found, and a number of studies have already found, therapeutic benefit to components of the marijuana plant. But we can't construe that to mean that now we should vote and legalize the entire raw plant for consumption and sales. That is, in my mind, an illogical conclusion to derive from the data.
I will point out that this number one here, treatment for chronic pain in adults, was for cannabis.
Yeah,
not
so,
cannabinoids.
so that was one of the studies that was in there. They looked at 10,000 studies. There was one study that looked like at the entire plant of marijuana. And again, I don't doubt that there was probably efficacy, but the question is from where? Is which component? There are over 500 components in the marijuana plant. CBD is one, THC is another. And these studies have all indicated that, yes, there's some promise for some of these components, but there's no scientific organization in this country or in this world that would say, well, you can smoke your medicine now because we found some benefits to some of the components, right? It doesn't make sense. You know, if you look at aspirin, we derive aspirin from willow bark. But we shouldn't be smoking willow bark to get pain relief, right? We should get aspirin. So you know, the point being that no, I don't think anybody disagrees with this science. I think the question is, okay, do we put this through a scientific process where it goes through clinical trials? You can get a prescription with dosage that we understand, manufactured with quality standards, or do we put this up to a political vote of the people or a political vote of our politicians, which, by the way, there's no precedent for that. We've never voted on our medicines in this country. This would be the first one to exempt from the FDA process. And I think that's troubling. And I'll leave off with this. I don't know how we'd all feel if Purdue Pharma came forward and said, we've got the new miracle drug. Let's put it up to a majority vote too. I think we'd be a little concerned. So while the FDA hasn't been perfect, the FDA helps insulate us from some of these regulatory failures that we see with marijuana today.
Is that a fair criticism? That there clearly is research that shows that cannabis is useful for these things.
Components of the cannabis plant. Yes.
Well, again, number one here is based on cannabis.
Well, that
was research for cannabis.
So that's one of the studies, and I will say that there are a lot of other research that has come out that actually refutes even the pain notion. So we still have a long way to go.
Well, I'm going to push you here because, again, if you look at these studies, they have very strong standards for what is conclusive and substantial evidence.
And I've read
one study.
Right.
It's not one study. This is dozens of studies with no refuting studies.
But what I will say,
I am going to push you on that.
That's the 2017 NAS. But last 2 years, Lancet Journal of Psychiatry, one of the foremost research institutions in the world, based in Canada, has done 2 consecutive studies that have found that there is no efficacy for pain. In fact, one of those studies, and it was this year from Lancet, found that actually medical marijuana patients actually needed to use more opioids to help with their pain after using marijuana. So not saying we have the gospel truth and that this has no efficacy for pain, but I am pushing back a little bit on you and saying this isn't the Bible, right? We've got a lot more research outside of the NAS, and the Lancet is an incredible institution. That
It's not the Bible, but the point is that this compilation was looking at dozens of studies. And so in terms of having the best information, it's certainly the closest that we can get. And one study from another, I'm not disparaging the Lancet, but those are individual papers that will affect on that. Let me bring Matt in here. Is that fair criticism in terms of it not being through the FDA process? That is true. Every other drug we run through an FDA process.
Not every drug has been treated the way this plant has been treated for decades. You know, we have to acknowledge the reality that this plant was subjected to a war seeking to eradicate its usage in society, a war that was largely waged in large part for racial reasons. You can go back to the 30s and what Anslinger was saying. And to me, I agree. I want more research. I want more Epidiolexes and Marinols. And I think that we'll get there. The point on the political way of achieving this, how else are we going to move Congress forward? How else are we going to get Congress to listen to the people of this country and reschedule or deschedule marijuana and eliminate the obstacles that still exist to its research? Right now, there's still one facility in the country, in Mississippi, that can grow marijuana for FDA-approved studies. And so these obstacles still exist. And the only reason that there's a serious conversation in Congress right now about major marijuana reform is because of what's happened at the state level. It's because states have enacted medical marijuana laws. Now up to 33 states with what my colleagues, consider effective medical marijuana laws. If voters in these different states had not passed these laws, whether through ballot initiative or through legislatures passing them, there would be no conversation in Congress. We would be still stuck with this unjust situation where sick people in this country are being deprived of effective medical treatments. To me, the choice is, do you compound the injustice that's already been inflicted on people? Because I view it as an injustice. Somebody who has epilepsy, who can't get relief from their seizures from any of the available medications, now they're getting some relief from whether it's CBD or whole plant. an injustice has been inflicted upon them. If we had not had this broken, totally misguided mindset for decades, the research would have already happened. So do we compound this injustice by continuing to deprive this person of legal, safe, regulated access to a medicine that works for them and tell them, sorry, until we get all the research done, you're still a criminal and you have to go get your medicine from an unregulated system? To me, given what we know about this plant, and given the power that we already give to doctors and nurse practitioners and healthcare providers across this country to prescribe far more powerful, far more addictive, far more lethal drugs, it only makes sense to, as an interim measure, to allow doctors and nurse practitioners to make recommendations on this plant. And in the meantime, we continue to do the research. And hopefully 20 years from now, there are a long list of treatments that have been subjected to the FDA process that work very well, that ultimately displace things like smoking and cannabis. I agree, it's never good to put something in your lungs. But if there's somebody here today saying, this is the best delivery system, until the medical industry comes up with something better, this is the best way for me to live a healthy, happy life, I don't believe that person should be treated like a criminal.
We're going to move on to a little bit different area in a second, but we both talked about research a lot. We all three have. Right now, research is really difficult because of scheduling. How do you and Sam feel about that issue?
So that's a great, the scheduling question is really, it's complicated because there are people out there who say, look, marijuana is scheduled with the same drugs like heroin, and marijuana is not like heroin, so why would it be scheduled that way? And on face value, it seems counterintuitive, but it's actually, the scheduling system is not a harm index. It actually looks at the medicinal benefit of the drug and the abuse, the potential for abuse. And so a lot of the research out there says that marijuana is absolutely an addictive substance. It's not, I'm not saying that it's like heroin, but it certainly is an addictive substance. And as of right now, the plant in its entirety does not have proven scientific medical benefit. Its components do, which is why it's been prescribed. But nonetheless, descheduling would actually not, I don't know what your organization's position is on rescheduling marijuana, but rescheduling marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, which is what people have talked about, would actually be terrible for the situation with medical marijuana in the 33 states right now, because they would have to take all of their products completely off the market, submit clinical trials to the FDA, and the FDA would have to review all of their products. And it would take their products off the market for a very long time, because it would essentially treat them like medical products. So I don't think rescheduling makes sense. What our organization has argued for is creating a new designation for marijuana, Schedule 1R, if you will, that basically would allow more research. It is a misnomer, though, that there's no research, right? We have the NAS, which reviewed 10,000 plus research studies on marijuana. We've got a ton of research that's been done, a lot of very important research that's been done just in the last 2 years on marijuana, especially the new highly potent marijuana we're seeing in a lot of the states have legalized. So
it's changing a lot, and I'm going to push on him, but I do want to push back and say that in this paper, in the NSS, they say there are specific regulatory barriers, including this classification of cannabis as Schedule 1, that impede the advancement of cannabis research. And I know a lot of researchers have said, we can't do research on what's on the street. Right. We have to get stuff that is from the 60s. It's not keeping up with the breeding. And so not denying that it's tough.
The
change of scheduling would help the research.
It would expand the research, but we do have research on heroin, cocaine, and all of our illicit drugs right now, and we have a very good idea of what they do. So I just think it's a little bit of a misnomer to say, we can't know for sure what's going on with marijuana unless we deschedule it. We've got a lot of research on marijuana. We've got a lot of research on all these illicit drugs so we know a lot of things already. So, but I do agree we should have more research. Our organization has no problem with research. In fact, we supported when NIDA came out and just said that they're going to open up, they're going to have more growers now than just one that you referred to. They're going to supply marijuana for research, and we support that.
I need to jump in here. I mean, the idea that marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug is absurd on its face. I mean, to say that this drug has a higher potential for addiction, is more dangerous for people than things like hydrocodone and Adderall, is absurd. And I don't think there's any defense for its current scheduling. My question to you is, you say changing its scheduling would result in these products being removed, but you're here arguing that those products shouldn't exist. I'm trying to understand why you don't think this should be rescheduled when we know it will help research.
Yes.
We want research, let's reschedule, let's get more research.
Well, the products I think that shouldn't exist, you mentioned earlier, we need legal, safe products. And that's what I want, is legal and safe products. I am skeptical of allowing a private industry, because that's that's what we're talking about here. If you legalize medical marijuana, you're allowing a private industry to take over in your state, which is exactly what happened in my state of Colorado. That's where I'm from. And what they do is they create all these, vaping crisis. Everyone heard of the marijuana vapes? That's what's being sold. That's the medical marijuana is no different.
The vaping is not medical marijuana.
Vaping is one of the most
It's a separate
significant
issue.
verticals of the marijuana industry. And if you take away vaping from the marijuana industry, then you're getting rid of a huge
That's
part
fine,
of the
but
market.
we're talking about medical
No,
marijuana.
but listen, so medical marijuana is not any different than recreational marijuana. It's still the same plant, and it's being sold in many of the same forms. In Colorado, when we legalized recreational marijuana, we had legal medical marijuana. And the same medical stores just changed their signs. They didn't change their products. They didn't change anything about it. So what I'm talking about is I don't think that's the best way to go for medicine. I don't think we set up ibuprofen shops and Purdue Pharma stores and whatever other kind of pharmaceutical stores that they get to directly just make whatever medication they want, put it up to a vote in your state and sell it to your people. And hopefully it's not reviewed by the FDA, so hopefully it's regulated and safe. We don't know. Vaping crises like what we're seeing right now.
Can I jump in? Because I do want to push on him a little bit. I've been pushing on you, and I'm going to do the same for him. But I think it is fair to point out that the vaping crisis that's going on right now is not the same debate as medical marijuana.
I think it is
that would
exactly
be
the
fair.
same because the medical marijuana dispensaries are selling the vapes. So we have a confirmed case in Delaware where a medical marijuana dispensary sold one of these deadly vapes with THC vaping oil, and it caused the lung illness that we're seeing.
Right.
So it is confirmed. It's on the press release
And I
of the
think
state of Delaware's website. So
that
you
vaping
can't-
is a
you can't
is a-
extricate it.
Let's talk about vaping. I'm not going to shy away from vaping. There is a vaping problem in this country right now. There are people that are suffering lung damage, and it's a bad thing. And the choices are as follows. Well, let me acknowledge, make it very clear. The vast majority of these vaping-induced lung disease issues are coming from the illicit market. They're coming from the black market.
We don't
And
know
a
that.
Hold on,
a CDC official was being questioned in Congress recently and even pushed back on the assertion that this is all coming from legal dispensaries. So the vast majority of them appear to be coming from the illicit market. So what are your choices? Do you ban all vaping, including legal vaping? Well, the problem with that is now you're pushing everybody that's vaping into the illicit market where the vast majority of the cases are originating. Instead, let's put in place regulations so that these vapes are safe, and let's increase the regulation of the legal vaping industry and the dispensaries that are selling them, and at the same time expand access into more states so that people don't have to go to the illicit market. The illicit market is the source of the vaping problem. By outlawing all vapes, you push more people into the illicit market.
Okay, we can
So
come
let me
back to
just-
some vaping, but we need to move.
I'll
Quick
just say
comment,
this,
and then we move
the
forward.
CDC and FDA have said both the legal and illegal markets are at play. They have not identified one.
They've said the
source.
vast majority are
They said
coming
both
from the illicit
markets
market.
are at.
And the CDC has, I will say, had some pretty inconsistent messaging on this. So
Yeah,
that science is developing, and now we're going to move on to some science, the next slide, that is going to be a little bit critical of where you're coming at. So this report, this NIS report, also says the evidence discussed in this report suggests that cannabis has both therapeutic value and public health risks, and that is emphasis that I added. Some of the very select public health risks, I'm not going to get into all of them. Addiction you brought up, intoxicated driving, and some potential serious negative mental health outcomes. So my question to you is, we're talking about vaping. Juul is a vaping company that spent a lot of money getting what they want in terms of rules. The opioid crisis, based in large part, significant part on companies taking advantage and really driving the crisis. I personally don't have much confidence that a private marijuana industry would have anything besides profit as their main driving goal. How are you going to address public health issues when you have a corporation that's really just trying to sell more marijuana?
It's a fair question. I need to acknowledge that all medicines in this company come from private industry. There's nothing special about medical marijuana in the sense that privately owned businesses are producing it and selling it. That, CVS is a private business. Purdue, these are all companies, so there's nothing unique about medical marijuana where it's coming from industry. All medicines come from industry. I think there are certainly those in the industry who are going to pursue profit above all else, and they're going to be tempted into what big tobacco did and misleading the public about the health effects of marijuana consumption, trying to use special types of advertising to lure in children. So what do? We learn the lessons from big tobacco. We put in place restrictions on advertising. We hold these companies accountable in terms of the types of claims that they can make. And all of that is possible when you legalize and regulate it. Then you can actually impose rules and control this industry. I don't speak for the industry. I don't work for the industry. I'm in this because I believe it's good public policy. And when I look at the industry, I see, a fair amount of greed. I also see some people that got into it because they had a personal story, whether it was somebody in their family that benefited from medical marijuana. So I don't think that we should, paint the entire industry as a bunch of greedy people. But the way to hold them accountable is by adopting intelligent, responsible public policies and restricting what they can and cannot do.
Please.
Yeah, I think, there's this idea of regulation, right? And one thing we have to really think about is we want to get this right. When it comes to allowing a drug industry, and you're absolutely right, we have private drug industries. How is our track record with these private drug industries? Well, not going great on the pharma front. Alcohol kills about 88,000 people a year. You have tobacco killing 150,000 people a year. Our drugs that we've allowed into our society are causing some serious carnage. And the question that I have is, A, do we want to go down this road again? Do we want to have another drug industry to deal with? And I can tell you just from my experience in Colorado, Denver Health issued a report last year that said 83% of the medical marijuana dispensaries in Colorado are recommending pot to pregnant mothers. And it's so bad across the country in states that have allowed medical marijuana that the United States Surgeon General just came out and issued the first Surgeon General's advisory on marijuana in 40 years. And he said several things. One is, there's no such thing as medical marijuana. Okay, so that's the top doctor in the nation who's saying there's no such thing as medical marijuana. Cannabinoids, components of it, FDA approves, drugs, absolutely, but this is a farce. And not only that, he said, with pregnant mothers and youth using this at the most alarming rate we've seen in this country, there are serious concerns because it has an absolutely detrimental impact to these demographics. So, I think there's a lot of concern there. So the question is not, should we have these medications, right? It's how. And the question for how is, why would we take the unprecedented action of exempting an entire industry, an entire drug, from the FDA process that all of our other medications have to go through? And the question is, what's the benefit of that? Who benefits? Well, if we're talking about people in terminal stages of life, as far as I'm concerned, they can get whatever drug they need. I'm not talking about criminalizing people who are, at the end of their life or desperate for treatment, need something. I'm not worried about that. But if we're talking about policy for medications, I just don't think it's a good idea to have a for-profit industry acting like what Purdue Pharma, their CEO, is now the CEO of a medical marijuana dispensary. And you got big tobacco investing. So do we want these guys to be out and about putting what they call medications without having any FDA authority over them, reviewing what they call medication? I think that's the big concern here. We need to look at this from a broader policy perspective.
And do you think you can put that genie back in the bottle? I mean, there are 3 states in the country that have not legalized medical marijuana. It's happening all around us.
More than 3 states. I think there's only 33 states that have some sort of medical marijuana. And actually, a number of those 33 states actually have only allowed maybe CBD or some other kind of oil. So that's actually kind of a misnomer in and of itself. But yes, I do think we can put the genie back in the bottle. I think we have to, because we're at a stage right now where this industry has really just rampantly grown and taken advantage of very lax regulations in these states. What you were talking about with Juul, it's a travesty. And the same playbook is being deployed with marijuana.
So can we write good policy? I mean, that's
Yes,
really the question.
and we should, and that's the thing.
Is prohibition the good policy, or can we write better regulations that better control these companies?
Yeah, well, I don't think really prohibition has anything to do with it, because what we're talking about with marijuana and this kind of quote-unquote medical marijuana is, should stores be able to sell marijuana so people can smoke it and use it, okay? But if this is going to be a medical discussion, then I think we need to approach it from the standpoint of science, public health. We should have a nonpartisan, neutral body like the FDA reviewing these medications, and absolutely we can do that.
Well, I would point out that, again, that comes back to the research. Right. And the nonpartisan, non-political body, I would argue, is the National Academy of Sciences.
That's one of them, yes.
That's one of them. So let's keep moving a little bit here. There's more things.
One response.
Please.
You're not putting this genie back in the bottle. And I think it's pretty important to recognize that of the 11 states that have fully legalized marijuana for recreational purposes, and of the 33 states that have effective medical marijuana laws, I'm not aware of a repeal bill passing even one chamber, let alone passing both chambers, let alone being vetoed by a governor. I'm not aware of any ballot initiative that has qualified for the ballot to repeal these laws. So to me, it's quite clear. The public have adopted these laws. They believe in them. They support them. And I want to just take a pragmatic approach to this. We know that people in Nebraska are going across the state border and getting marijuana and bringing it back, and they're using it for medical purposes. We know that. Okay, and your choice as voters is, do we just accept that and have these people go medicate themselves, or do we give them the legal ability to have a conversation with their doctor in this state, a doctor that can be aware of the research out there in a way a patient might not be, make a recommendation, that patient can then go to a licensed regulated dispensary, know exactly what they're getting, and be able to alleviate their symptoms. But if this ballot initiative doesn't pass, Nebraskans are still going to be driving across the border, getting marijuana, and bringing it back here. And what I'm putting forward as an idea is, let's not accept that chaos, and let's instead create a conservative medical marijuana law that works for this state, that allows those conversations to go. The more conversations that patients can have with their doctors about the subject, the more informed their decisions will be. And right now, we're pushing them away from an informed decision-making process. That's what prohibition of medical marijuana does.
Let's see what people are doing in the state, and we're going to have more time to talk about the policies in front of us. So if you're willing, again, it's anonymous, complete this statement for us. You can check as many of these as you want. I have used marijuana to treat a medical problem for recreation, or never, I have not used marijuana. We've got 7 people willing to participate, 20, 30, wonderful. So this is interesting. I want to see where people sit. Kat, I don't know if you're able to, are you able to show that as a percentage? There we go. Wonderful. So this is pretty consistent with national numbers. I just looked up a Pew study. I think it was 48% of Americans, adult Americans, have used marijuana. Is that roughly what you've heard?
Yeah.
Something about half the country, and that's what we're looking at about here. Do these numbers surprise you guys? I mean, they get to the sort of pragmatic suggestions that you're saying, that this is happening.
Yeah, I think, there's a key point here, is there's a difference between somebody trying marijuana, which, about half of the population, just under, has tried it, and being a regular user of it. Most people don't keep using marijuana. Most people try it once and they just go on. But only about 10% of the people in this country are regular users. That's according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, the foremost survey on drug attitudes that we have. So that is where we get this data, and we know that about 10% of the people in this country are regular users. So, that's just one point, is that this is not kind of this, fatal scenario like maybe an alcohol of the world where you say, well, 60% of people use this, we can't prohibit it. Not that many people in this country use marijuana on a regular basis. And so,
Well, 10% is still,
yeah, it's an amount, but it's
a
not
lot of
that
people.
much. It's not that much.
it's millions of people.
But when you look at the grand scale of things, do we make policies across the entire country on medicine and change the way medicine's worked for this country for over 100 years based on a segment of the population? Then the other question is I see a lot of recreation here. So is this about medical and medicine, or is this about recreational use of marijuana? Because last I checked, this was about medicine.
Sure.
That's so if we're going to mingle the two and we're just going to acknowledge that this is a recreational ballot, or maybe heading towards recreational, which I don't know what you guys have planned, I think that's the point here, is if we're going to talk about medicine, let's talk about medicine. And if this is truly about recreation,
There's a quarter of the room that says that they've used it for medicine.
And I don't think that the results of this speak to the
Right.
nature
No,
of
it's
this
not-
ballot
no,
initiative.
it's not a representative
And let me speak on legalization. I'll be honest. I've worked on legalization campaigns, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan. I believe that legalization is a good public policy, but that is not what I'm advocating for here in Nebraska right now. I don't believe in forcing policies on states that don't want them. Our polling showed a very strong majority of Nebraskans support medical marijuana. You say your poll had it much closer to 50. I have a tough time believing that, because the polling I saw is in line with what I've seen in other similarly conservative states. And I believe
Nebraska's not every state. I'll just say that.
That's sure, but there you can categorize certain states in terms of their political leanings, and I've seen polls in states that have similar political characteristics that show much higher support. But I'm not here to advocate for full legalization. I'm here to advocate for a ballot initiative that would establish a medical marijuana law. I don't think that passing this ballot initiative in any way binds this state to future legalization. It may very well be the case that this initiative passes, the legislature passes an implementation bill, the program works well, Nebraskans like it, and the support for legalization never gets above 50%. And maybe it's 10 years, 20 years before legalization passes in this state. I don't know. I'm only here to talk about medical. In other states where I'm working, I'm doing legalization. But there's nothing in this initiative that leads to full legalization. This initiative grants the legislature specific powers to pass rules, regulations, laws, and to define the terms. It says serious medical condition. I believe that gives the legislature the authority to define what serious medical conditions are. The initiative says that the legislature has the authority to expeditiously solve the issue of how businesses are licensed. So there's a lot of power in this initiative that's granted to the legislature, and I believe that if this initiative passes, the legislature in 2021 will pass an implementation bill because the members of the legislature don't want a fully open, quasi-legalization policy. They're going to want a medical marijuana policy. That's what they're going to enact. So we're not talking about legalization here. We're talking about medical, and this initiative is a medical
Kat,
marijuana
can you move us
initiative.
forward one slide? We'll talk about, we should be on to policy, I think, at that point. So we've been talking around policy quite a bit. We'll come back to some of these other questions I had. Right now, I had mentioned before, there are two possible paths for medical marijuana. LB 110, this allows and regulates access to medical marijuana. It's on general file. It went through the committee process. You testified against it. Members from MPP testified for it last spring. It went through the committee. They made some changes that my understanding, I don't know what your perspective is on it, my understanding is those changes were more restrictive to get it through the committee. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, to an extent.
And at this point, it's sitting on general file in the unicameral. So somebody could pick it up and run with it. Senator Wishart is who introduced it. I don't believe that she's going to pick it up and run with it. I have no idea. But the other option is this amendment, which is what you're working on. There's a ballot initiative to create a constitutional right to medical marijuana.
Or both. Legislature could pass that bill this upcoming session, and then the voters could approve the amendment at the same time.
Both could happen. My question to you is, if we're going to control public health concerns, of which there are, and they're noted and they're in the research, if we're going to control those public health concerns, how are we going to do that when you have a constitutional right to something?
Because the constitutional initiative will grant the legislature the authority to pass laws that exert control over the program. The legislature will have the authority to determine how businesses are licensed, how many cultivators there are, how many large cultivators versus small cultivators there are. I believe that this initiative would even grant the legislature to place a limit on a plant count for how many plants a patient could possess. So to me, this initiative gives a lot of authority to the legislature to do exactly what you said, to place parameters on this program, place restrictions on this program. And so to me, establishing a constitutional right is how we get the legislature to act. You know, if you are in my shoes and your goal is to get a medical marijuana law in Nebraska that will help people in this state, what do? Well, first you try to get a bill passed through the unicameral legislature. And there have been advocates who've been trying to do that for years, and there was a concerted effort this year to get one passed. Legislature is not ready to enact that law. So what do? Do we just wait and just tell the patients in this state we're just going to have to wait until the political conditions change? That was not an acceptable option to us either. This was the best option. This constitutional amendment immediately grants patients a legal protection. If they've got a recommendation from a doctor or nurse practitioner, they are going to be protected under the law. But at the same time, it exerts pressure on the legislature to figure out the details. Without passing a constitutional amendment that the legislature itself can't immediately repeal, there's no way to exert that pressure on the legislature to ultimately come up with the details of a medical marijuana policy. So for us as advocates, putting forth a constitutional amendment and getting it passed was the way to A, immediately protect patients, and B, to exert pressure on the legislature to figure out the details. We didn't want to write every detail into this initiative because that's not the right way to do public policy. When you put something in the Constitution, it can only be changed by the voters at the ballot box. That would be irresponsible of us to try to put every little detail into this constitutional amendment and give the legislature no authority to change anything in the future.
But isn't that also part of what makes it difficult to regulate? I mean, I know you say that there's lots of provisions. I'm not a lawyer, but I've talked to lawyers who are concerned that this, as a constitutional amendment, a constitutional right, will kind of open it wide open, that it's going to be very difficult to regulate in a productive way.
I'd like to read directly from the initiative.
Let's not read the whole thing.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Thank you.
That would be very boring for all involved. The rights protected in this section shall only be subject to reasonable laws, rules, and regulations that promote the health and safety of individuals authorized to use cannabis as provided in this section. Such laws, rules, or regulations shall not impose an undue burden on the exercise of rights protected by this section. So it says reasonable laws, rules, and regulations. So if the legislature passes a bill that is reasonable, and that would be something for a court potentially to determine, was it reasonable? Hopefully we would never get to a court battle. Hopefully the legislature would pass a reasonable implementation bill that is in line with what other states are doing, and it goes into effect. But clearly, it states reasonable laws, rules, and regulations. It also says, and I'll stop reading in a second, this subsection shall not prevent the expeditious licensing and reasonable regulation of entities and agents acting under subsection 3 of this section, which is the section that says the businesses can sell marijuana. So it clearly states that the legislature has this authority and to work out the details of this policy. And I believe that would stand up in court. This is a conservative state with a conservative judiciary. I don't think this is a judiciary that is going to be itching for the chance to slap down the legislature when the legislature is making a good faith effort to come up with a conservative implementation bill. And we as advocates would look forward to working with the legislature to come up with that bill and make sure that we balance the need to restrict and control and regulate the activities of this medical marijuana industry while also providing the access that the people in this state want and that the voters of this state support.
Let's get Luke
Matt,
in here on this.
yeah, I had a great dinner with you, so I know you've got your hearts in the right place. But let me tell you, when you have a bill that says reasonable efforts, lawyers can dance circles all around that. And that's the problem that I have with this, is the marijuana industry is taking its playbook right out of the big tobacco, Juul playbook, where they have all these lobbyists that are some of the best lobbyists in the business, and they get the regulations that they want. And how does that play out in practice, right, in states that legalize? Well, here's how it plays out. Colorado, we're not allowed to have child-friendly products, right, for medical or recreational. And yet we have gummies, like little neon-colored gummy plants and gummy fruit type flavors. We have thin mint flavored marijuana, all kinds of things that are clearly targeting kids, and yet they're legal and they're allowed in our regulated market. How did that happen?
Do you think we could pass good regulations that would address that?
Here's the problem. Great question, because a lot of us, I think, okay, we can be reasonable, we can figure this out. Look at Washington State. They said, let's ban gummy bears. So they put that in a bill to ban gummy bears last year. Massive industry lobbying effort. Gummy bears are still allowed in Washington State. So you can write these regulations however you want. These regulations, that are in this initiative are very open-ended. And your perspective on that is very, I think, optimistic, right? We're leaving it wide open so the legislature can decide. A more pessimistic view of that may be, well, the industry is going to take advantage of this wide open legislation just like they take advantage of all of our other laws, right? Whether you look at alcohol or you look at the way marijuana is working out some of the other industries. So that's the concern that I have, is we have child-friendly products that are getting out, getting away with it. Potency limits, we're not even talking about potency on this. The legislature is going to have to deal with that if it were to pass. And my question is, again, there's a sense of urgency maybe for the patients who are in, last stages of care, and I have compassion on them. Spent my whole first 10 years of my career working for people who don't have insurance in the healthcare field, helping them get care, so I care about that. But that is a very small number of folks that we can come up with another policy solution for. We should not pass this legislation. I mean, you look at the bill right now that's at the legislature.
LB 110.
Yeah, LB 110. A lot of the qualifying conditions that they have listed in that bill have little to no basis in science. The research does not bear it out. And the biggest one is pain. And pain is very broad. How is a physician going to tell you, oh, your pain doesn't qualify, so you can't get marijuana?
Well, I would
So-
push, again, back to the original NAS. This
Right,
is
but-
the best compilation of science we have.
Well,
Pain is one conclusive
That's a
from
compilation of
cannabis.
science, but we have a lot of other science, very reputable institutions, Lancet, that says that that's not the case, that maybe it doesn't help as much, or if it does, it needs to be components. No, you can't go to anybody from these NAS research studies who'll say, smoke a joint and that's your medicine. I mean, we don't smoke
I
the
don't
medicines
think that's
in
what they're
this
saying.
country.
The
Right.
research was mostly based
Right.
on nabiximols, which comes out of Europe, that is a cannabis preparation.
Right. So my point being is this is totally rushing, and the only winners from this are the industry. They're going to carve up this bill the
No,
way they
the-
want it.
the
They're
winners-
going to have they're going to get all the profit. They're going to have their lobbyists raiding the hill. This guy always outraises me, so he's got a lot more money than I do. But I will just speak from having to hustle out there in the States. This industry is very well oiled. They take advantage. Guys like him with great intentions, and I do think he has great intentions. He wants to help get patients the medicine they need. But their bills then get taken advantage of by this industry. And I'm saying we need to advocate, where is the bill to try to make the FDA-approved medical medications more accessible to more patients? We've got FDA-approved medications you can get a prescription for that are
And
dosed.
which ones are, this is Marinol?
Marinol,
and
Epidiolex, there are multiple
Because
others.
the research, it also does show, from my understanding, that Marinol, for example, is pure THC, synthetic THC. And there's a lot of side effects compared to a balanced product like nabiximols that has CBD and THC in it. So, but again, this brings us
if you wanna
back to
talk about side
science, right?
effects, we got a whole lot
This
of-
brings us
yeah.
back to research.
Well,
and
if you look
being
at the
able to do more.
research just with NAS, right? Marijuana, they found you had the listed there. They found substantial substantial evidence of serious mental health problems from use of marijuana, of addiction, of a whole host of public health problems with marijuana.
And so
and of course,
I'd like to
smoking.
bring this back and
Yeah.
push you a little bit. I was trying to push him on the amendment, and I think you brought up fair points. That
Can I
yeah, there
weigh
are
in on one point that you
make
made?
it quick,
Yes.
because you are reading off the thing, and that's just killing me.
Am I? Who here believes that a legislature unwilling to even pass a medical marijuana law would a year later be totally susceptible to the lobbying efforts of the industry? That doesn't make sense, okay? This is a conservative legislature unwilling even to pass medical marijuana. The idea that next year after this initiative passes, that all of a sudden they're just going to do everything that the marijuana industry says, it's just not believable.
All right, that's fair enough. Let me push you a little bit on LB 110. I agree, the amendment I think is a little bit frightening at times, because I think a good lawyer can work on it. I know you guys are trying to make it so that it can be regulated properly, but LB 110, from what I understand, is a pretty highly regulated bill. Is there no solution that brings medical marijuana to people based on the science that
I think
you or Sam would be
we need to,
comfortable with?
I want to go to the scientists and say, what do they think works best for bringing a medication to market? And what science has told us time and again is bring it through a nonpartisan government body, the FDA, that will review it, make it go through clinical trials, make it have industry standards and go through manufacturing requirements, et cetera.
So are
It'll
you
be
willing to change,
reviewed.
to support changing scheduling then, so that more research can happen and bring things to?
Yeah,
the
so our
FDA?
organization has supported a change in scheduling, not descheduling it, but a change in scheduling to allow more research, because we absolutely support that.
So is that something you guys can work together on?
Oh,
Because you
absolutely.
both agree. Wouldn't that be
I think
interesting?
we both
if the
signed
two
on
of
to the
you-
same bill in Congress to do that, I'm pretty sure. And if not, we should. And we can talk about that afterward. But absolutely, more research, and there need to be more FDA-approved medications. So I think that is absolutely the way to go. Now, for the folks who they need it, they're desperate, there's nothing else is working, and they're end of life or whatever else, we can talk about solutions for them. But I don't think opening this wide open to a whole new drug industry is going to be good for Nebraska. I can say for Colorado, didn't work out well. They're not abiding by the regulations that have been set for the state. We don't know what's in these products. We've had hundreds of thousands of recalls. It has not been this, you hear regulated and it sounds really good, and it's a great, it's a poll-tested message that both of us know works, and that's why it ends up in ballots. The word reasonable is in the ballots. They know because they poll what really sounds reasonable. And so it's going to be up to the public, if this ballot comes before them, to look beyond a well-funded, well-heeled campaign, right? Because, the folks, look, there's a profit incentive for an industry to get legalized, right? This is not a nonprofit industry, they're for profit. They want to sell products. They've made them much more potent and more addictive because they want to drive more profit. Okay, they have a profit incentive to come to Nebraska. They've got a profit incentive to get you to let them in.
Can I push you on that a little bit, and then I'm going to let you jump in here. this isn't going to happen in the United States of America, but if there was a nonprofit industry, if there was a government-controlled access to medical marijuana, would Sam then be for it?
Well, I think government-controlled access to all drugs is good. That's what we have with the FDA. My concern is that people think when you legalize medical marijuana that the FDA is reviewing it and you're going to get a prescription from your doctor. But the fact is, the FDA doesn't review it. It's not regulated. You don't know what is in it, and your doctor has no clue what to tell you. Is your doctor going to tell you take a puff and a half a day of marijuana? I mean, the science is not there. The American Medical Association, totally opposed to this. Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, all the best healthcare professionals in our country are saying marijuana as a raw plant is not medicine. Absolutely, the cannabinoids have therapeutic benefit, and we need more research. We need more approved medications. But to rush into this, for folks who need it, I can see why it's so appealing. But the dark side of allowing this is you have a whole industry that then has a completely ulterior motive. You can't get them back in the bottle. They run circles around the regulations, and you're in a way different place than you wanted to be.
Matt, did you want to jump in on that?
If Luke were right, then I'd be sitting on a campaign bank account that would have all the money I needed to win this campaign, right? I mean, if
It feels like you've got that sometimes, I got to tell you.
No, well, you say I always outraised you. I don't. I was outraised in Arizona, lost in Arizona.
That was the one. That was the one, and we won that one.
But so if he's right, if this is an effort by the marijuana industry to get a foothold in Nebraska, get another population of people to suck dry through addiction, why aren't they putting money into this campaign? They're not putting money into this campaign. I'd like for some more people to step up and help us fund this campaign. But this idea that the marijuana industry is targeted Nebraska and it's its next victim is just not reality. Here's how this is going to play out. If this initiative passes, there's then going to be a debate in the legislature. They're going to pass an implementation bill. And only after that are any marijuana businesses that exist in other states going to look at Nebraska. They're going to wait and see, how does the licensing work in Nebraska? Is there a requirement for in-state residency in order to have a license? So that the marijuana industry is going to sit back and they're going to wait. And they're going to see how this plays out in the legislature. They're going to see what the implementation bill looks like. They're going to see what the licensing looks like, and then they might get involved. You're conflating, experiences in Colorado and Washington, which were full legalization states, which creates a very, very different profit motive for these
Here's a
companies.
great example.
If you can sell to anybody that's over 21, versus you can only sell through people that have a recommendation through a strictly regulated system, the profit motives are very different. And so the behaviors of those industries are different. I'm not aware of the industry doing the types of things that you described in Colorado or Washington in medical marijuana states. And for what it's worth, I actually agree that there's no need for edibles to look like commercially available candy. I'm against that. That sometimes, my friends on my side don't like that. I don't see a need for edibles to look like Sour Patch Kids. So I'm with you there.
I know we're on the same page. And that is where it really defies reason that there are so many states that allow it. And what that says is that the common sense of the public is not served; it's the lobbyists who are served with these programs. And just to give an example, outside of Colorado,
this
Washington,
is medical
Oklahoma,
marijuana, though. Let's not get too far into the gummies.
Talking about Oklahoma. So Oklahoma, less than a year into medical marijuana legalization, okay, they have 2,500 medical marijuana businesses in just about 8 to 9 months of legalization of medical marijuana. Okay, and they're selling absolutely. It's basically a pot shop for every 100 patients. Okay, it's pure inundation, pure commercialization. Okay, and so that is what you're looking at. This industry is not going to just sit on the sidelines and say, it's just about highly regulated medicines and whatever else. He used the right word here. He said you're going to get a recommendation. That's a carefully chosen word because you can't get a prescription. So this industry is going to put up a bunch of pot shops. They're going to have a lot of supply.
Well, the number
they're
does
going to need
get
to drive more
regulated in
demand.
the bill. LB 10, if it passed, the constitutional amendment, I think you're right. It could be wide open. LB 110, I don't know the exact specifics, but my understanding is that they limit the number of shops and those sorts of things.
I hope so.
We're going to move on to some questions from the audience here in just a minute. I'd like you quickly to each maybe tell me one thing that MPP gets right, and I'm going to have you do the same thing.
Great.
If you could think of one thing that you think they get right and they deserve credit for.
Well, I will say that I think he's one of the most talented ballot campaign managers in the country.
And why is that? Does he have
because
an argument that you think is
he knows what he's doing, first of all. A lot of money, too. But I did get you in New York, though, so I will take that. But no, I think, I think something they do really well is they go to patient populations, folks who have not been heard and folks whose voices maybe are otherwise not able to get out there. They need help. Their medicines have not been working. We disagree about what the solution is for them, but I think they do a really good job.
Are you putting forward solutions that address those folks?
Yeah, I think we are, yes, absolutely. I've talked about some of the bills we've signed on to, and we're doing a lot more work to try to get more FDA-approved products out there. And we've actually even worked with companies that are trying to do this the right way, trying to grow medical marijuana, the marijuana plant, do the research on it under federal funding. We've actually advocated for that because we put our money where our mouth is. We want FDA-approved, regulated medications that have gone through the scientific process. That's why we're opposed to this kind of jury rigging of the process.
I have a nice thing to say.
Wonderful. I
I've
love
got
nice
it
things
ready.
to say.
That took me a second to come up with it. It's a good thing. But first, I got to ask a question because I have come here and
That was a bait
stated.
switch right there.
It was. I've come here and stated what I think Nebraska should do. It's up to the voters of this state. I've said, here's what I think you should do. You should pass this initiative and then have the legislature enact an implementation bill. What do you think Nebraska should do? You don't think they should pass LB 110. You don't think they should pass the amendment. So what should they do, and whom do you think needs to be helped? You've mentioned end-of-life people a number of times. So what do you think that this state should do?
I think what the state needs to do is try to make the marijuana-based medications that have been approved more accessible. I think the state needs to have an education campaign for people on what the harms are of marijuana, because everyone out there is hearing industry slogans right now that it solves insomnia, it cures cancer, all things that have absolutely no scientific basis, and yet those are the messages that are out there. I think Nebraska needs to invest in a public health campaign to educate the public on what marijuana's impact is. I think Nebraskans need to be very much informed about what's going on in the states that have legalized, so that you go into this with making an educated vote. I think that's really important.
But for
And
somebody,
obviously, of course, I think you should oppose both of these bills, because I think they're jury rigging the process and they're ultimately going to harm Nebraskans. The last, I worked in healthcare, like I said. It was my job to help get more care for uninsured patients, okay, some of our most vulnerable populations in the state of Colorado. The last thing that I want is big tobacco or a pharma executive or Juul or someone else saying, hey, this is a medicine, let's stuff it in your neighborhood and get all the vulnerable people on it and have them get harmed.
Well, that's
the last thing that
I would
want.
say that's
and that
a
is
little
exactly
bit
what's
extreme.
happening.
I mean, you've met
So
the
there's
senator that's pushing LB 110. I don't think that
I
jury
didn't say
rigging
that.
is a fair term.
Well, I think that, it is getting around the established process for over 100 years for what medications have had.
Okay,
but I do want to
but jury rigging
recognize
is
that Senator Wisher is in the audience, and I so appreciate the work she's done and the service she's done to the state. We just disagree on this bill. I think that this is it's too fast, it's too soon, and there's a lot we don't
And
know.
that's fair. I think I'm objecting a little bit to the term jury rig. I think that's a little bit harsh. And I want him to say something nice about you. We're waiting on that.
Yep,
He
and then I
tried
think I need to come up with a question, too.
real quick though, under what he said, if you're somebody with epilepsy,
It's taken a
and
while for him to get to the compliment.
Nothing available works to you. None of the pharmaceutical anti-seizure medications work for you. None of the prescription cannabinoid medications work for you. He's saying you're still a criminal if you try to stop your
That's
seizures.
not what I'm saying.
Well, you kind of are in effect.
Wait,
The nice
gotta get
thing
to
I'll
your
say,
nice thing, man.
they've done a good
a
job.
long time,
They've-
I'll just say.
Well,
I'll take
I
care of
think
that.
if we had a meter on how much time we've talked, but we talked about that earlier with the debates. The nice thing I'll say is I think that you and your organization have done a good job looking at the diversity of this industry, the lack thereof. I think it's troubling as well. I think this industry should be more representative of the country and of society as a whole, and I think you've honed in on something that's worthwhile in terms of the debate on this issue.
Did you say you wanted a question for him? Otherwise, we're going to go to the audience.
No, I think we should go to the audience. I was teasing.
But I mean, no,
I like
but
these.
can I ask, you say I'm wrong when I say this
Oh, yeah.
person with
So
epilepsy.
I will say, I mean, we're not, like I said, if you're somebody who needs medication, we don't want to throw you in prison for that. If you're a cancer patient and, God knows you need, whatever it is you think you need, I want you to have it. I don't want you to be thrown behind bars for that. So I think there's ways we can reduce We don't need to have people going to prison for having this, but we certainly don't want to completely circumvent the medical process, again, that we've had as established. And it's not been perfect. I'm not here to be the FDA's champion and say, the FDA is perfect and they're great. They totally blew it with opioids, okay? And I think we all know that. But I do think that process, okay, has a lot more benefit to the public because it serves the public. It's government. You can vote people out. A little optimistic here for those who are more pessimistic, but at least they're beholden to the people. You put this in the hands of private industry, it's all about profit.
So if you want, I'm going to push you on that though. If you want to help those folks, however you're defining terminal patients, whatever, then it seems like there should be some version of LB 110 that you say, let's do it.
So the Congress recently passed a bill that allows patients who are to use trial medications. I think we should expand those bills. I mean, the problem that I have with this is the premise, right? We're looking for a solution to a problem, and we say, okay, well, let's just completely alter the laws we have on marijuana just as a whole. Well, I think that's way too far. We need to look at the medications that have been approved, expanding the research, getting access to experimental drugs early in the stages of clinical trials, which Congress has taken a step forward in doing. I think we should be pushing our representatives to ask for more of that. I think it's a tall ask to tell your state legislature to say, hey, you're going to regulate the latest and greatest industry in this country, the marijuana industry, after the experiences we've had with alcohol, tobacco, and pharma. So I think it's a tall ask. And in Colorado, we had no idea what was coming.
Let's move on to some questions from the audience. Is that all right? What's the first one we're going to deal with? I don't know what we got here. You guys want one picked out? What are your views on selling medical marijuana through something like a public benefit corporation, one that pursues public benefit instead of profit? Certainly, much of your criticism has been of the profit-driven motive. If LB 110 said, no, this is a nonprofit industry, would your concerns go away?
No, because again, I don't believe that you can't just, ask any scientist out there, ask any physician, the American Medical Association, Cleveland Clinic, Mayo, you talk about any of these research bodies, Lancet Journal of Psychiatry, no one says you can smoke your medicine, okay? So it just doesn't make sense. We can't, even if it's a nonprofit, it's still not going to be approved by the FDA. You're still not going to get a prescription. One of the great things about going to your doctor is they're going to give you a prescription. You're going to get a medication, and you know what? You're going to know your dose. You're going to get the amount. You're going to know how much to take, how much is too much, how much is too little. We don't have that for medical marijuana. It's just the plant. You can buy a vape, or you can buy a gummy, or you can whatever the product is for marijuana. That's what you're going to get, and that's going to be medical marijuana. And to me, that's just not a great way to do medicine.
It's fair. Do you want to respond to that?
You mentioned a few groups, prominent groups, to kind of lend credibility. I want to note the American Nurses Association, American Public Health Association, the Epilepsy Foundation. These are just some of the well-respected organizations that support increasing access to medical marijuana. If a state wanted to embark on a path whereby there was a public entity that cultivated and produced medical marijuana, I'm good with that. I think that's actually an interesting idea that could be attempted in tandem with the private industry that produces all medications in this country, also having a role to play in cultivation. Actually, in Utah, there's been an attempt at that, whereby marijuana would be dispensed both through state agencies and private businesses. So in theory, yes, if a state wanted to attempt that, I'd be in favor of it. I would support it more if it was in tandem with a private industry approach at the same time, because I think that there are benefits to competition, and if the state is only competing against itself, does that yield less effective medications for people? But is that something that should be attempted? Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea.
Let's do another question. You got something else for us, Kat? To what extent have any pharma companies researched cannabis or cannabinoids? That is a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
So there are a lot of major pharma companies that are moving into marijuana, and so you've got Novartis. You have Insys has actually gone into it. They were originally opposed to it. Now they're into it. A lot of the major pharma companies are now they're researching this. Obviously, there are marijuana-based drugs that are being reviewed right now, and those are being put forth by presumably pharma companies as well.
I don't know the name of the company that makes nabiximols. That's a product that's available in Europe, but not in the U.S. And it's a herbal preparation that's 50% THC, 50% CBD. It goes in as a spray, a sublingual spray under your tongue. I don't know the name of that company, but I'm not sure why. Do you know why that's not legal in the States? Why that hasn't gone through an FDA process?
I think it may be in the FDA process. I'm not sure. So obviously every country has a different process for research and review, and a lot of I think Epidiolex was, approved in another country, and then it came here and it was approved here. So it follows a process.
Do you have anything to add on what other pharma companies are doing?
I think that covered it, and this is to be expected. Why would, of course, pharmaceutical companies are going to start researching and have interest in this emerging field of medicine. It's natural, organic. It doesn't indicate nefarious motives on the parts of advocates who are trying to pass these laws. And again, I just really think you're painting this picture, this really negative picture where this is just a backdoor way for pharmaceutical companies to harm the American people once again. Like I said earlier, this initiative passes. There's going to be an implementation bill. I would really be shocked if marijuana companies exerted pressure on that legislative process that yielded that bill. The profit motive in a fully recreational state is very different than what it would be in Nebraska with a restricted conservative medical marijuana law. I think it's worth saying, yes, pharmaceutical companies have done some bad things in this country. And INSIS, you mentioned, they donated $500,000 against the Arizona legalization campaign. They were a manufacturer of fentanyl patches. And they did some terrible things with bribing doctors through speakers' fees. And the opioid epidemic has been a nightmare. And we're seeing, Purdue and the Sackler family pay for that. But is everything the pharmaceutical country does in this country horrible? I mean, I have people in my family that only are able to live lives because of the drugs that are made available through the pharmaceutical industry. To malign this entire industry as evil, I don't think is fair. We should hold the pharmaceutical industry accountable for its actions, whether it's through opioids or otherwise, but we shouldn't say that everything the pharmaceutical industry does is terrible. It gives incredible quality of life to over half the population, probably tens and tens of millions of people live healthier, better lives, are alive because of the drugs that come from the pharmaceutical industry. So to just say pharmaceutical industry bad, marijuana is of interest to them, ergo marijuana is bad, I know that's not doing justice to your argument, but that kind of is the crux of what I hear often out across the country. I just think it misses so many pieces. And again, this medical marijuana law passes. This is going to be a medical marijuana law market in a small population state. Okay, this is not the first in the nation to do legalization like Colorado. Okay, it's not a huge population state with 36 million people in California. Okay, I just don't see the industry coming into Nebraska and skewing the will of the people, because I believe the will of the people here is that we want a medical marijuana law, but we want it regulated the right way. We want it controlled. And that's what we're trying to do with this initiative. And then when the legislature convenes after it's passed, they can effectuate the will of the people. They'll know that if they don't do anything, they will create an open policy that the legislature won't want and the voters won't want.
Real quick, and then let's get one or two more questions quickly.
Well, and let me just say, I appreciate your optimism with the industry, but having started two companies and I sold one company, a for-profit company is exactly what its name indicates. It's a for-profit company. They are designed and they are accountable to their shareholders, not to public health, okay? And so their whole point is they want to make products that are going to delight the public. It's great when you're selling Apple iPhones. It's not great when you're selling an addictive drug, right? And what I'm saying is, look, we have a massive marijuana vaping crisis right now. Only a few years into some of these states legalizing marijuana, okay? Do we really want to have more public health crises? Do we really want to open the door to more of this industry? Of course they're going to want to come into your state and sell as many products as they can, make them more potent. The potency these days is 99% potency for these products, not 3% like it was back in the 70s. Okay?
An interesting thing
a totally different drug.
on that is that Marinol is 100% THC.
Yes, but it's dosed and you can get a
very,
prescription, and you're not just taking it like a
rough
dab
for a
where
lot
you're
of
taking it
people
up
to do
the
Let's get another question if we can. We'll do one, maybe two more, depending on how much you guys want to chat on them. Of the full states that have full marijuana legalization, how many of them legalize medical marijuana?
All of them, every single one, simple answer.
Every single one? Oh, interesting. Okay.
I mean, I'm not going to hide. Every state that went on to full legalization passed medical first. But again, there's nothing about this policy that binds this state to have legalization. It's the product of shifting attitudes, the same shifting attitudes that have resulted in over 80% of the country supporting some kind of medical marijuana law are the same shifting attitudes that have pushed people in the direction of full legalization. a recognition that prohibition has been an abject failure. It has failed in every respect. The goal of prohibition for decades was to eradicate usage in society. Didn't work. All we did was put people in jails and ruin and disrupt lives of otherwise law-abiding people. So the American people recognize that prohibition has been a total failure, and they're shifting in the direction of medical, and they're shifting in the direction of legalization. But just because that's the case in other states, that doesn't mean Nebraska has to have a legalization law. You can vote for this medical marijuana law knowing that the decision on legalization is a separate decision that will be made at a future point. And so, I mean, I'm sure there are voters here in this room who are thinking, I support you, I like your medical marijuana idea, but if I pass this, aren't I going to get legalization in the near future? And I think while that has been a trend in other states, all those states are more liberal states where the levels of support for legalization were already higher. So I think you can vote in favor of this medical marijuana policy in good conscience, knowing you're getting a medical marijuana law and that you're not necessarily getting more than that.
You got anything you want to follow up on? We'll do one last question after that.
Yeah, I think, to his point, he's saying, okay, well, ignore the trends of the past. It's not going to happen here. So I don't know. I mean, you have to, one thing I was always told by my dad was he said, what's the one thing we learn from history? So we don't learn from history, right? And so I think we can look to other states and say, A, how's it going in those states, and do I want that here in Nebraska? I brought up 3 examples of 3 different states where medical marijuana programs have been a disaster. B, I think we need to look at this and say, what do I think the impact's going to be in my community? Do I think that this is going to expand? And what's interesting is, I've told you, these medical marijuana companies are absolutely ready for recreational. They have a profit incentive to go to recreational, and they have a profit incentive to sell a lot of product. Okay, and we cannot separate that profit motive from this conversation. We've seen what happens with other industries that have drugs. They've got great lobbyists, and they really get the regulations the way they want them. It's not going to serve the people, and that's my concern.
The regulations, as I understand, LB 110.
Everybody thinks they've got a very
Relatively
restrictive
strict.
regulation. Everybody thinks that.
Everybody.
Colorado, we thought we had. Here's a great example. Illinois said we're going to be the standard for the whole country with they legalized marijuana through the legislature. Okay, they became the first state to do that in Illinois. And Illinois said we're going to be the standard to the world for social equity, including minorities and those communities most impacted by the war on drugs in our marijuana programs. Well, guess what? They've announced all the licenses that they've awarded for marijuana stores in Illinois. None of them are for minorities of any kind.
And you brought that up.
And they said it was going to be the standard. In the bill, the whole point of passing the bill was for social equity programs, and they didn't even accomplish that stated goal. So again, we're promised a lot. And how many of us can think of times politicians have promised us, or our legislatures have promised us that this is going to be done exactly the way you want it. We promise we're going to get it right. It's going to be reasonable. And then you have a bill that has horrific outcomes happen. So we can't be living in a vacuum here. We should look at the history and say it's going to be imperfect. Do I want to allow another drug to go a completely different route than any other medical drug has gone? Or do I want to stick with a system that maybe has a lot more success rate? And I think that's where you have to think.
So one thing, I don't know that anybody in Nebraska looks to Illinois for leadership on policy.
But I was saying to look at them as a case study example because we've been
I'm not
talking about other
criticizing you.
states.
I'm making fun of Illinois.
Yes.
I grew up there.
Illinois.
It's okay,
I was born in Illinois, and so it's definitely a.
I want to respond to one thing. I'm not saying ignore trends, but if in 10 years 70% of the people of this state support full legalization,
Which is what he wants.
no, I'm not trying to push anybody towards legalization. I'm just here to advocate for medical marijuana. But if in 5 years 70% of this state supports legalization, why shouldn't the will of the people be respected? That's why I'm here in the first place.
So you'll have
That's a
nothing to
fair
do with
point.
recreational legalization at all.
I'm not going to push for
So
legalization
you'll never be a part
until
of the ballot to legalize recreational in Nebraska.
until I see solid polling that shows the will of the people's being ignored. I'm never going to advocate to any donor, oh, let's go start spending money in Nebraska and let's start convincing people that legalization is a good thing. That's not what we do. We go into states and launch ballot initiatives when the support is above 50%, with one exception, that was Arizona. But for every other campaign I've been involved in, we go in when the will of the people is being ignored. We use the ballot initiative process as a recourse to effectuate the will of the people, because legislative bodies have ways of skewing the opinions of the electorate on certain issues, especially in this highly polarized political environment we live in. So the ballot initiative process is a way for the people to have a check against the legislature, and when the will of the people is such that they want to change in policy and they're not
Quick
getting
last
it,
word.
we're here to help
On this.
effectuate the will of the people.
So I will just say that, who's really good at effectuating the will of the people is a very well-oiled campaign with really good, slick messaging. And you look at the marijuana industry, they've invested in all the states that they've tried to get legalization through. They put millions of dollars into these campaigns. I mean, they raised $40 million to try to legalize in California.
They put barely any money into Maine.
Millions and millions into these states. So they have great slogans, they have great marketing stores, and they know exactly what to say to trip your trigger, to make you think, oh, maybe we should just do that. It's no big deal.
We're going to move on to one last question quickly. No, we're going to move on. We're almost done.
But
real quickly,
Maine,
I will say,
Massachusetts, Michigan, hardly any money from the industry. So that's just
Disagree.
factually
not true.
false.
And I will say, I sat down and tried to understand these laws. I sat down with Senator Wishart. I know you've interacted with her plenty. My understanding is that that's not, the motivation for her is not coming from marketing and marijuana industry
I don't think
money.
so either.
And I don't think you think that either. So last question, and we're going to do this quick because people are getting sick of us, I think. How can doctors advise if there are no guidelines from the FDA? That's a fair question.
It's a great question.
I'll kick it over to you.
Doctors can look at the wealth of research that's already been done in this country and abroad and inform themselves on what kind of conditions are treatable through medical cannabis and make that recommendation. It's not a perfect system, but it's better than forcing that patient into an illicit market where they can't even consult with a doctor or nurse practitioner. Allowing an imperfect system whereby a doctor doesn't have all the information they need but has a good amount of information they need, that is preferable to providing no legal, regulated, safe access to the patient. I'm not saying what I'm advocating for is perfect, but it's a lot better than the status quo of doing nothing.
Quick follow-up for wrap-up, and then I'm going to make you guys say nice things again. This is the last question.
Start with him, so he'll go first.
So quick follow-up, make your point, and then we're going to be
I think that this is the crux of the question that the audience must consider tonight and must consider before they vote is there is no guideline, there is no dosage, there is no prescription. So, the research that's out there is very hit or miss. We have the NAS, we have other studies, there's a preponderance of evidence. The point is, the public was never supposed to make a decision on medications. How many of you voted on ibuprofen? How many of you voted on albuterol, an inhaler? How many of you voted on any of these medications, right? And so how can we go through all of this research, talk to all the scientists, all 350 million Americans, and try to make an informed decision on a medicine? It doesn't make sense. We need the experts to help us with that. And the experts are telling us that the best process to do this is not to just blow the doors wide open on a drug. Look, the last thing that I want to have happen is have a patient get just a random recommendation from a doctor, for medical marijuana, go to a medical marijuana dispensary, get a vape that is a part of this vaping crisis, and have their lungs have a severe illness because of that, because that's confirmed to have happened in Delaware. That's confirmed to have happened in other states. The CDC and FDA have both confirmed that, okay? So that's the last thing we want is patients to be taken advantage of, and that's why we have to have responsible policies that get people exactly the medication they need in a dosed form that is regulated.
Okay.
And we can't do it this way.
We're gonna move on. I want some input from you guys. If we have the next slide, I think it's your Kat. No, we're not going to do any more questions. Here we go. I would love to see if people would weigh in on these statements, and I'm going to give you guys the question that after people, if they're willing to answer this, then I want you to, a good friend of mine is an economist and likes to say, every choice is a loss, right? It's kind of a negative way to look at the world perhaps, but I think it's fair to say when you make a choice, you're going to lose something, okay? So I'd like each of you to tell me, if we choose to go your route, what do we lose? If we choose to go your route, what do we lose? Okay, because I don't think, and I don't think anyone in this room thinks there's a silver bullet that going one route is going to solve all our problems.
There isn't a silver
So we're going to let these guys answer a little bit. I'll let you get a chance to think. Please don't turn it into your wrap-up statement because you already had your wrap-up statement. I want to hear, what do we lose if we go your route? Okay?
Do I get a wrap-up statement?
You had your wrap-up right before his wrap-up.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, it was a good wrap-up. I liked it. I thought it was nice. All right. I'll start with you. If we go your route, what do we lose? What are we losing by legalizing medical marijuana?
I suppose we lose some sense of certainty that everything we do is perfect. I'm struggling, I'm trying to, in good faith, answer this question. I mean, if you need everything to be done absolutely perfectly, then I guess don't vote for this. But if you're willing to accept a little imperfection in public policy and help some people, then you'll want to vote for this. But I'm trying to think of something. Maybe
Luke,
I'll
what
be
do we
inspired.
lose if we continue to prohibit any use of medical marijuana in this state?
This is your hardest say nice
It's a great,
things
tough question.
by the way.
Oh, man. I guess we lose, that's a tough one. I guess to some degree, we lose the sense of, I guess, direct voter control, I would say, over this process to some degree. I think there's a sense that the people should be able to make a decision on this. And, maybe to some degree, that would be a loss in certain people's eye. Is that
Fair enough, fair enough. I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys being patient with us. There's some additional resources, Lydia Foundation, Good Talks, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, if you want to read more about their work, Marijuana Policy Project. Humanities Nebraska supported our work tonight. On your way out or online, please donate to Lydia Foundation or Smart.
And can I just say thank you, Alex, for a
Humanities Nebraska.
tremendous
Absolutely.
panel, and thank you to the Lydia Foundation for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. And Kat, will you back up and put that last slide on? Thank you. I appreciate it.